Torah in front of all of Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, the men and the women and children, and the ger, which is the, and I transliterated that, the stranger or the sojourner who is in your town. So any non-Jews who happen to be right there in the midst, take place, so that they may hear, learn, fear Adonai your God, and be careful to observe all of the words of the Torah. Their children who have not known will hear and learn to fear Adonai your God as long as you live on the land which you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. Now in the midst of this are several tenets that are just, to me, astounding. Of course, I highlighted 5 words which we're going to go over each one of those words at a later slide. In that order, assemble, hear, learn, fear, and observe are all really preeminent within this text. Think about this for 1 minute. At the end of every 7 years, the Torah was only read every 7 years in ancient Israel. And in the midst of those 7 years, it was up to the parents to teach these things to their children orally. And they waited for the next recitation of the book of Deuteronomy. It was only the book of Deuteronomy that was read. And when the tradition took place, before we get to that, their children who have not known will hear. So you get this aspect of teaching verbally, orally, out loud. You're reading, you're reciting, you're speaking. And all of that to say that that's in essence what the Torah service is built upon, is this aspect of speaking the words aloud so that all those in attendance who have not known will now know. To me, it's profound. And it was incumbent upon the parents and the grandparents who were there every seventh year to recite these things to their children so that they would know, grow up, and learn to teach their children the same thing. So it was for Jew, even for the non-Jew who happened to be in the town, the stranger or the sojourner who had connected themselves to the household of Israel, that they hear, learn, fear, and be careful to observe all the words of this Torah. Their children who have not known will hear and learn to fear Adonai your God as long as you live on the land which you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. And of course, the contrast here, the opposite of this, is that if you didn't fear, assemble, hear, learn, and observe, and you didn't tell your children what was the end result, you will be evacuated off of the land. So he says here, as long as you live on the land. So, part of the, it was, what's the word that I'm looking for? Anyway, so their staying on the land required their obedience. I'll just say that. There was a word I was thinking of. So, it was a commandment to read the Torah. This was the first of the 5 words here, hakel. And as time went on, the hakel, which is the assemble, which is the first word that I highlighted in the previous slide, it was one of the 613 positive commandments where it says, you shall assemble. And of course, we're all pretty familiar with the word kahal, where we get kehilah. A kehilah of something like my wife's parents' congregation, kehilah, we got a congregation of the line of Judah. From kahal, we get, of course, the word assembly, because that's what it means. Jewish translators of the Septuagint rendered the word kahal as ecclesia in the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and ecclesia, ironically, was later translated as church into the English. And of course, we know that that's certainly not the most adequate of translation. In one way, has kind of led us to the strange predicament that we have been in our Western body today. Whereas the original intent of kahal was in essence an assembly of God-loving, God-fearing individuals. And today it's become what is called the entity of an institution. Actually, even beyond the institution, a physical building, if you can think of how ironic that is. Which is really not its intent at all. The commandment, the mitzvah of hakel, which was one of the 613, was really performed by the king. If you remember that it was required of the king to write his own Torah. We read that in the book of Ezekiel. I think he carried it with him, and it was up to him. He was the one that did the public
greeting.
Okay. So from kings to commoners, we see a transition here. Now it shall come about when he sits, speaking of the king, on his throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of his Torah on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Adonai his God by carefully observing all the words of this Torah and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his country, that's interesting, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of his death. So one of the ways in which the king was to be able to take hold and maintain his grasp on his kingship or his authority was by fulfilling this commandment. And the tradition became that the king himself, as it says here, he shall write for himself a copy, and he shall read it all the days of his life. And he was the one that read it publicly to the people. Now, of course, we know that many hundreds of years went by as many of these evil kings arose and fell, that this obviously didn't take place. In fact, the Torah fell away completely, so much so that they didn't even have one copy. So the mitzvah of hakel, or assemble, was done by the king, who would read aloud to the assembly the Torah scroll he himself wrote. That, to me, is amazing. That his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen. Think about that for 1 second. The humility and the tendency of Torah towards impartiality, and how, when you talked about impartiality when it came to weights and measures, when it came to judgment against your neighbor or in a court of law, and the Torah itself has this mysterious spiritual way of bringing us down to the level of all other people and helping us to understand that regardless of our earthly position, in the end we are all the same creatures in God himself. We were born the same way, we shall return in the same fashion, and we will all stand before him in the same way.
It goes along with what happened on Sinai when the Lord told Moses to go down to the people. Because until I read that, I always thought Moses was on the mountain, because that was the picture you always saw moving around. And all that, but Moses was just kind of like everybody else, getting the Torah, just like everybody else. By the Lord, because he sent them down to talk to people.
Yeah, but then he ascended to give the tablets.
Later.
Yes. No, and with the whole idea of, and all of these, when Esau said all these things we shall do, they didn't even have the actual tablets yet. He had just shared with them the word, and they said, all that you have pronounced we shall do. So the way in which it was disseminated to the commoner, of course, was via the king who wrote his scroll and read it aloud. And that's what I have right here. So I forgot my own slides here. Quite possibly the very scroll he wrote. Time went on, more wicked kings ascended the throne. Decades would go by with no Torah being read aloud, possibly for hundreds of years, leaving the people in a state of spiritual starvation. And like
the histories of Torah, that there's a few kings after David that one discovers a lone scroll and says, "What is this? Why haven't we done
exactly
all that it commands?"
Exactly, and the people, they heard it read aloud, and they were on it.
You read that here in Nehemiah. In fact, that's actually after they went back. But you can begin to see the spiritual emaciation of the people. They were starving, and they were following really the actions of the king. If the king was wicked in his generation, many of the people were as well. When the 10 tribes separated and went up north, and they created their own temple, they created their own system of worship, and they took much of the gold that was in the temple and created their own idols and whatnot. Many of the people followed suit with the false priesthood and with the king. And oftentimes, as the leadership did, so the people would follow. That was kind of the general rule of thumb. And of course, there were some exceptions to the rule there.
But so that's why it's so important, which is kind of goes back to the point I made several weeks ago about, did Adonai want a king over the people, or did he want himself to be the one and only king? You get the sense in the Torah that he wanted to be the king of the people. But over time, it may not have been his perfect will, but he allowed it to take place. And he gave this as a gift to the people, which they naturally abused, because he knew how prone the people were as sheep to follow false shepherds.
And as the king did, so would the people. And this is exactly what happened. So after the return from the Babylonian dispersion, an event which was the direct result of the absence of Torah, a special assembly was created in order to prevent another dispersion from taking place. Now, I'm not going to get into what I'm about to share, but I just want to share one more thing that took place. Was that you've all heard of fences around the commandments themselves. Israel realized that the main reason why they were dispersed was because they disobeyed God, they disobeyed His Torah, they fell into idolatry, and naturally they were dispersed from the land. So what began when they came back, one aspect of what took place was fences, and we see that in the Talmud today, so lest you would have to break through various fences before you broke the actual commandment. Okay? And that's one of the things that was developed when they came back, because the leadership gathered and said, listen, we cannot afford another dispersion. What do we have to do to avoid another dispersion? Well, naturally, we have to obey God's word. How do we do that? Let's protect each and every single commandment. So naturally, they formed fences around. Many of those fences came in the form of oral tradition, all these oral laws.
My favorite illustration for explaining the fences around the Torah is this. You have two parents and a young child, and one parent says to the other, make sure that Junior here doesn't put his hand on a hot stove, and then he goes away. So the other parent stays behind and sees the child coming near the stove. So they say, stay out of the kitchen. Because if you're not in the kitchen, you can't touch the stove. And then they see that you're playing so close to the kitchen that you're about to come in. So they say, I tell you what, don't come downstairs. Your bedroom is upstairs, go upstairs. Pretty soon they're locked in the room. And
they're not burning themselves, but they're suffering another type of a fate.
Exactly.
Which is total separation for the family. Yeah, that's a great, thanks for sharing that.
There's so many fences protecting them from the actual sin that you forget what it was they were trying to avoid in the first place.
Exactly. Which is one of the things really that Yeshua was up against. It wasn't necessarily the practices, the observances, it was the heart condition of the people, because they failed to see that the fences that they had created and at certain times were preeminent above the actual commandment itself. And the people were suffering as a result of it.
So the men who put this together, Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the Great Assembly, 5th century BCE, right when they came back from the Babylonian dispersion, this men of the Great Assembly were responsible really for the people themselves and for preventing another dispersion. Comprised of 120 prophets, sages, and scribes. Obviously post-exilic and was headed up by Ezra. 12 years later, he was joined by Nehemiah, and it's taught that they received the Torah from the 3 post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah. Yes, yeah, and they received it because in the exile, the Torah for many had been completely forgotten, just as it was before that. And so they received it, the tradition was that they received it from these 3 post-exilic prophets, and then began establishing parameters and fences around each of the individual commandments so that the people would never again see the dispersion. Ezra heads this up.
And now we're starting to see the upswing because we started with the public recitation every 7 years. Torah fell away and people are dispersed. Now we're seeing an upswing where the Torah is being restored to its rightful position. Ezra was in charge of this.
So that's who they're referring to in the sayings of God, where it says, God gave the Torah to Moses, the elders, the judges,
Exactly. Men of the Great Assembly were headed up by Ezra and Nehemiah along with all the other 118 prophets and sages.
How could they prevent another dispersion? Well, there were several ways, and all of them focused on a greater understanding of Torah.
Of course, because the reason they were dispersed is because they neglected Torah.
So now let's make Torah prohibited again. But how could the people understand if they weren't told?
Because of course we saw that in the Deuteronomy text that if the children aren't told,
They will fall away as well. You have to tell them. So scribes were put into place to write more and more scrolls, because before scrolls were very, very limited, read by the king only every 7 years, and the pressure upon the parents and the grandparents to teach these children. Can you imagine that? Kids, we have another 7 years before we hear the words. We didn't have scriptures and scrolls, and very few are in between. And you speak it every single day. You recite it with song, with words, so much so to where it's ingrained. You memorize the text, which is amazing to me.
Is it true that most of the Torah was originally sung? It was done as a song because songs were easier to write.
Absolutely. And the same tradition and practice takes place today. You go to the yeshivas, and you see the children chanting and singing. That's why we sing the liturgies. It's so much easier to get the tune in your head than just speaking the words every single week. And singing, you all know how easy it is for us to get that ingrained in our minds through song. So more and more scrolls were written because they said, listen, back in the day, only the king had it. In order to avoid another dispersion, we need to have better and greater access to the Torah. So they wrote more and more scrolls. More and more religious communities had access to that. The 7th year reading was still enforced, and along with the introduction of regular weekly public readings, which were put into place by Ezra himself. So now we move more into the modern understanding of the Torah scroll. Exactly, the synagogue aspect, which is actually birthed from the verse in the book of Ezekiel. Okay, the synagogues didn't begin until the 100s to the 50s BCE, but the foundation was laid by the men of the Great Assembly. So it was still enforced every 7 years, but Ezra says, listen, that was obviously not adequate enough. We don't want to take that away, but we would like to add to reading. They didn't add to the word necessarily, but they wanted to add the reading of the word. And so it's traditionally believed that Ezra enforced 3 times a week traditional reading that many Orthodox synagogues use today. I don't know how much validity there is to that, but at the very least, weekly public readings now, so people can get it that much more ingrained in their head. So the first example of this public reading instituted by Ezra is in the book of Nehemiah 8. And all the people gathered as one man, and I love that, because the way in which Torah, it's just not only does it bring you down to the level of all other people, but creates a one new man aspect, as all of us are united under it. Yes, Ke'ish Echad is the transliteration of that, as one new man. At the square which was in front of the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the Torah to Moshe, which Adonai had given him. Then Ezra the priest brought the Torah before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. What is the first day of the 7th month? Yes, it is. Good job. It's the day of the sounding of the trumpets. Very interesting that he's reading this. Good job, Margot. He read from it before the square, which was in front of the water gate, from early morning until midday. Kind of like what we do each and every week. We're not necessarily reading, but when we're gathering together, we're
early morning until midday in the presence of men and women, those who can understand. And all the people were attentive to the book of the Torah, hanging by its every word. Probably could have heard a pin drop. Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was standing above all the people. And when he opened it, all the people stood up. Now, we talked about the bima. Remember the altars, the elevated altars, and how the people were exiled as a result of these elevated altars, which were called bamot. Okay. Now we know the bima as the raised-up place in the synagogue where the Torah school resides. This is another aspect of the modern-day service. Is this verse here, where Ezra was with the Torah at a higher elevation than the people, and he spoke the word to the rest of the congregation. All the people stood up. Then Ezra blessed Adonai, the great God, and the people answered, Amen, Amen, while lifting up their hands. Then they bowed low and worshipped Adonai with their faces to the ground. Imagine that picture of just a multitude of people all in one motion, falling on the floor, all as a result of the reading of the Torah aloud. So Nehemiah and Ezra are two of my favorite books because it really shows to what extent these men of the Great Assembly went to preserve the Word, to preserve the Torah itself, and the due diligence that they had to keep the people from being exiled yet again. And it all had to do with obedience to the Lord and being mindful of His ways. So they went from a 7th year reading to a multiple times a week reading. And the people were so moved that they bowed and worshiped Adonai on their faces to the ground. So going back to those 5 words that I highlighted earlier, assemble, fear, all those. Hakel was the first one, and of course the mitzvah, one of the 613 of the mitzvot is called Hakel, and that was of course the ancient tradition of the king reading aloud to the people. Here, with the intent to do Shama, where we get the word Shema. Shema also means to obey. So we have a combination of the hearing with the intent to obey, with the intent to do. Learn was the 3rd word that was highlighted. He says you need to assemble, you need to hear, you need to learn. Okay. This is a very interesting picture here. Lamad, where we get the word lilmod, which is to teach. Okay, teach the Torah, lilmod Torah. And it's also to discipline, to train, to teach. So it's teaching and learning at the same time, which is very interesting biblically in that, speaking for myself, oftentimes if I'm preparing a message or a class or something, it never fails that I learn as much as everybody else here. As you're doing the research and you're doing the study, you go, I never knew that. That would be great. And some people assume that you just have this knowledge. Well, that's not necessarily true. In your research, you gain understanding, and then you share it with other people. So, the root lamad, to learn, is this cyclical learning and teaching at the same time. As you're learning, you're teaching. As you're teaching, you're learning. Okay. The root of that is manmad, and manmad is an ox goad. You see in the scriptures of our shepherd staff, from where all of it comes from the lamed, which was, if you go back to the Paleo Hebrew of ancient times, the lamed comes from the picture of the crooked stick. It was really the malmad, or the ox goad, this pokey stick that you would get your stubborn animal to move by. And that's really what the letter lamed represents. Coming from malmad, it's in essence the picture of an ox goad, a crooked stick. That guy's stick is crooked, but I had ox in there. I thought, we had a cool picture. For those of us who need those illustrations. So he says, assemble, learn, or hear, learn, which is to teach, to discipline, and to be disciplined, to be trained. And then yareh, it's the reverential, awe-inspiring fear. You have the chad, which is the fear, which is dreadful. You don't want that type of fear. The fear which is reverential and awe-inspiring. You shall fear Adonai your God. This is the Yahweh. So he says, you shall assemble, you shall hear the words, you shall learn. In essence, we are so many times stubborn like oxen, aren't we? And the Torah is used as an ox goad many times to poke and prod us into action, into obedience. And that learning and that training, this cyclical fashion, what does it do? It creates a fear, an awe, inspiration within each and every one of us. I mean, again, speaking for myself, it never fails as I read the Word and as I immerse myself in these things, the fear of Adonai grows greater and greater within me. The more knowledge, the more understanding that enters into these vessels of ours, the more and more poked we are, the more fearful we become. Not fearful of His punishment per se, but a reverential fear of His awe. He is the only one who is awesome. It's because of this, you know, when I was growing up, I was never allowed to say the word awesome. I've shared that before. Ever. And my uncle would always say there was no one awesome but God. No one. So don't ever use the word awesome in connection with anything physical on this earth. Only He is worthy. So that was kind of a family, you know, and when I was a kid, I was like, talking to my cousins, man, your dad's crazy, what, you know what? But now I know, it all makes sense. You know, you teach these things to your children, and in the end, they won't stray too far from it. I did stray, but the Lord has brought me back around. So the reverential, awe-inspiring fear which develops when we assemble, we hear with the intent to do. As a result, we transfer that hearing into the cyclical pattern of discipline, training, being disciplined, being trained, teaching, learning. We're poked in that regard. That creates fear in us, which promotes asa, to do, to observe, to do and accomplish. So we don't just come together, we don't just hear, we don't just listen, we don't just get disciplined or trained. The finality of all of this is to transfer all of this understanding, what we've seen, tasted, heard, and it transfers from the cerebral to the halakha, the walking out of our feet in the action. Observe, do, and accomplish. But of course, you can't observe, do, or accomplish if you don't know the word from the beginning. So assemble and to have someone read it aloud is naturally the first steps for that. And the end result is the obedience of the nation. So, with that, the reason I did that, I think, was just to help us to really get the idea of reverence and this awe-inspiring in that when the Torah is brought out, especially like Nehemiah 8, people stood and they bowed. We don't do all those things all the time, but the people were so desirous to be in the presence of God. And the Torah came out, the words were spoken, and they were just awestruck by the power and the majesty of it all. And, you know, getting reacquainted with that, reviewing those things is so important for us because we live in a very complacent age, really, and it's easy for us to fall into the same patterns as the nations. You know, every home has a plethora of scriptures. You can click of a mouse, you can hear this, you can hear that. I mean, everything is so readily accessible, you just take it for granted. So easily. Imagine if you lived in a place, China suffered this, North Korea, some of these other places, even in Africa, where you couldn't get a Bible if you lived. You know, people would have to smuggle in torn pages of the Bible. And I remember hearing in Korea that some congregations only had one page that was smuggled in. People were willing to give their life, and this page was all that the congregation had to study from. So imagine that. You know, this is just all ways to help create a newfound desire for the holiness and the reverence of God's Word.
Filled with the genealogy.
Yeah, exactly. You know, well, you would get to know that genealogy, and it would edify you in every way, shape, and form. But if it was that much today, folks, I know we've done this 100 times, but the Lord has blessed us with this one page. Imagine that. You know, so it's just getting us outside of the Western box of complacency that we've been in. We've really been lulled to sleep oftentimes in this body. Yeah, that's why I kind of wanted to bring in some of that, the past aspect of the reading of the Torah, the recitation by parents and grandparents to their children,
that they didn't have the access to this. They only even did it with the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. And here we are today, we bask in the light of Torah. We have it everywhere we go. Every time we want it, oh, you know, I won't attend that study. You know. And this is how we think, but we need to get out of that complacency. So one of the ways in which I wanted to kind of introduce us into Torah service, Torah participation, was to kind of get that foundation of the awe and the reverence for the Lord. And that it's not a game. It really isn't. The Torah is a holy word, and any aspect of participation with it should be treated in the same way that the children of Israel treated the Torah in my day. So, you know, right today I kind of wanted to touch more on not as much assisting in the Torah service, but coming up and making aliyah. I think doing the other aspect, we'll probably touch on that another time. But I wanted to just kind of get people familiar with the readings, with the blessings, the practices. The one thing that we definitely ask is that for covering, you know, we don't teach that women have to be covered in dana talit all the time. It's typically more of a male practice. Some congregations allow women. It's not one of those things that I say you have to, you don't have to. Some congregations are very, like with Reform, Reconstructionist Judaism, even some in conservative, a lot of the women are not even male kippot. You see that in some traditional synagogues. Male talitot. I prefer a more feminine expression. I grabbed Leah's here. All that to say that a person who comes up to make aliyah, if you would like to, you're a woman, we do ask that you have a feminine talit to wear, head covering. Some ladies would like to have a scarf on their head. Leah makes these feminine beaded kippot that she's made for the women, which, oh, here it is. So she's made these, you know, and it's something that, of course, you wouldn't have to wear all day, but to come up for an aliyah, it's like a very feminine type of covering. And her parents' congregation law ladies wear them. So again, you know, whether it's a head covering or some kind of a beaded kippot, or a veil or something like that, but we definitely want to have tzitzit. It's important to have tzitzit. Leah thought it's, you know, it's a little bit overkill to have a shawl and, you know, head covering, veil type of a thing, and a tzitzit shawl. So that's why the
tzitzit has to be on a four-corner garment. It cannot just be attached to your belt loops.
Yeah, exactly. Some people have made a habit of that. You know, we like to wear. I've always been of the conviction that we want to do things in an authentic fashion because we don't want to be a stumbling block. One day, if you know you're in the Jewish community or whatnot, you will know what you're talking about. Okay, you won't do things haphazardly. You won't have half knowledge about these things. It's important at the foundational level for all of us to understand why we're doing the things we do and understand them in their fullness. And in my opinion, in the Jewish context, it's very, very important. Although some of these things are traditions, nonetheless, traditions are very, very important. They're kind of a mainstay of our people. And if we want to have any type of a place, any type of a say in the Jewish community in the future for participation, it's very important that we know what we're talking about and that we don't cause stumbling blocks.
But tzitzit are okay for women?
During the Torah service, to touch the Torah scroll, to have it, it's one of our traditions. I don't promote the idea of women wearing tzitzit all the time, women wearing talitot all the time. It's just one thing that we ask just during the Torah service when you're making aliyah, because the tradition is, and I'll get into that, I'll touch, or whoever's reading will touch it, and that person would then touch it and then do the reading. That is a real touchy issue because a lot of people in the Messianic Jewish expression have real issue with women donning what is seen as male garments. Some Messianic congregations are very much proponents of women donning all these things. Leah's parents are going to be one of them. Some, it's an absolute taboo. It's just not done. Mainly because of, you know, and the sons of Israel and the children of Israel, that it's really seen as a male garment. But just during the Torah service, if you're making aliyah, we would like to have the tzitzit, and then you can take it off after you're done.